So as I continue thinking about trades, let's talk about the Jimmy Butler Wolves-Bulls trade, where the trade itself was the Bulls ending up with LaVine, the 7th pick, which became Markkanen, Chris Dunn, and then they traded away their pick, and the Wolves got Jimmy. And the thing is like players have changed teams and stuff since then, but I feel like it's still kind of interesting to look at who, if anyone, has won this trade just yet. So if we look at it strictly from just the Wolves side for a little bit, actually, we'll go to the Bulls first, because for them it's a little more simple. They have LaVine, Markkanen, and Chris Dunn. And between those three guys, I mean, LaVine has gotten better, Markkanen has disappointed so far, Chris Dunn is okay, I guess. And I guess it's tough to remember, but I feel like there was a possibility for the Bulls to keep Jimmy Butler. They would have had to give him a lot of money, and they would have had some cap space, because I know they let Rondo walk, and maybe they would have just been better off doing that. I think it's still an interesting thing. I mean, they clearly have not set the world on fire with the stuff that they got back in the trade. And there's other things you can mention between Boylan and whatever else, but I don't think it's a certainty that trading Jimmy Butler was actually the right move for Chicago. Now, maybe the relationship just couldn't be fixed, but I'm just saying, if they would have went the other way, I feel like there is a world in which they potentially could have done something. Now, the problem is it still would have been Gar Forman and John Paxson running the show, and, well, maybe that means nothing would have ended up being right until they did what they did recently, which was basically just decide to clean house. But, I don't know. It's just interesting. Now, as it's tough to speculate what they really would have done if they went that route, but I think it's something to at least bring up, especially because they traded their pick in that move as well. And the pick itself, it ended up being Justin Patton, who hasn't done anything in the league, but who's to say the Bulls would have picked him? Maybe they would have picked John Collins or OG Anunoby, or maybe they would have traded that pick for something else, you know? Like, again, if they had just decided we're all in on Jimmy, I feel like they could have ended up doing things a little differently, and maybe they would have hit on a trade or something like that. So the reason I mention that is because I feel like there is this belief that the Bulls got amazing value back for Jimmy, and I just don't agree. Now, of course, the page is not complete yet on that, but up to this point, I think it's still something to kind of question. Minnesota's becomes pretty complicated, and it's like, do you want to do the whole thing where it's, well, Jimmy Butler became this, and then they traded that for that, so in a way, does that mean that they really ended up with, what would it be, Malik Beasley and a Brooklyn pick or something for Jimmy Butler? It is a pretty wild timeline. So the initial trade was they got Jimmy Butler for LaVine and, 7th pick and all that stuff. Of course, the instant success was great. I mean, they were damn good that first year. Jimmy got hurt, and then they dipped down as a result. And if Jimmy didn't lose his mind with his teammates, then he'd probably still be there. And, how good would they really be? I don't know. But then, of course, they had to move him for Covington and Saric, and that was when his stock was pretty low. But then Covington ended up moving in that big 3-team trade with like 12 players or whatever, and the Wolves ended up with Malik Beasley, the Nets pick for this year, which I think is going to be the 16th pick, and maybe they could nail that one, maybe not. But then they also traded Dario Saric for the 6th pick in the 2019 draft, which they used to select Jarrett Culver. And up to this point, Saric hasn't really popped, and I'm not very high on Culver, but we'll have to see with him. It's kind of wild when you think just how big the Jimmy Butler trade web has stretched out, mainly for the Wolves. For Chicago, it's pretty much the same. They have all the pieces they traded for. So, I don't know. Is it still a wait and see for the Wolves? I mean, at this point, it's Jarrett Culver, Malik Beasley, the Nets pick, and for what it's worth, 1 year of postseason stuff where they lost in round 1 to the Rockets, I believe, right? So again, it's like, has either team won the trade? I mean, in terms of playoff success, it's the Wolves. But what's better long term? Is it Malik Beasley, the 16th pick, and Jarrett Culver, or Zach LaVine, Lauri Markkanen, and Chris Dunn? I would definitely project Chicago to have better odds if we're just comparing all those guys. Unless that 16th pick ends up being crazy. Now, it's possible that I missed some details somewhere in that whole thing, and I do want to remember again, the Bulls did give up a pick. And I don't care if it ended up being some player who wasn't that great. They could have done something better with that selection. So that matters in all this as well. I don't know. I think that's more of a subjective thing. I guess. See, here's the thing, though. I still feel like the Wolves have a better future than the Bulls because of Towns. But if I remove Towns from the equation, then I guess strictly talking about the assets that remain, perhaps the Bulls ended up winning the move. But even then, it's like, if Jimmy just simply doesn't lose his mind, then the Wolves clearly win this. Because then you've got Jimmy, Towns, and, well, I don't know what would have happened with Wiggins. Would they still have made a move? I don't know. That all gets tricky, but I mean, they won 47 games, and that was with Jimmy missing time. So, yeah, Minnesota, it seemed like they had turned it around until they, of course, had not. And just another thing to point out, because I think it's interesting, is the Wolves were 2 games from the 3 seed that year. And Jimmy played, 59 games? Yeah, and they were 37-22 with him, and I think they were 10-13 without him. So if he had played in 20 of those games or so, there's a chance the Wolves could have been like the 3 seed or something, and that could have really shaken up how that year turned out for them. I mean, there's a world in which that 2018 Wolves team went on at least a bit of a playoff run. They would have lost to the Warriors or the Rockets eventually, but could have been a nice round 2 appearance instead of a round 1 washing, you know what I mean? And maybe that goes into this whole thing, maybe it doesn't. Now, I guess one thing I should bring up is when the Bulls made the move for Jimmy, they knew that they were going to lose more games, right? So in a way, it's like, should I also count Wendell Carter's draft pick in this whole thing? Because if they would have kept Jimmy, they probably would have been too good to draft Wendell. But even then, if we're operating in a world in which they kept Jimmy and they tried to build it up, and they declined Rondo's second year because it was a partially guaranteed contract, I mean, who's to say they couldn't have just gotten a couple of solid enough centers? They already had Robin Lopez on the roster, who was pretty okay a couple years ago, so I don't know. I don't know where I end up on the whole thing, but I think it's interesting to bring up nonetheless. I do think one thing that's kind of interesting to look at is, for the Bulls, again, a big part of it was probably they didn't want to give Jimmy the super max. They might have been fearful about his health and all that. And we've seen Miami just be like, yeah, we'll take on Jimmy Butler, we don't care. And to be fair, Miami had a bunch of low-salary dudes be really good this year for them. Hero and Duncan Robinson, Bam, and Kendrick Nunn and stuff. But, like, Miami just took them on, and they saw their salary situation for the next few years, and they were like, well, if we can get Jimmy in here now, we feel good about these young guys, because I have to assume they envisioned most of these guys being good for them. And they were like, all right, let's big up the culture for a couple of years, and then once we got some money off the books, Dragic being the main one, well, that and like Olynyk and Myers Leonard and stuff, then we can really make a splash, and we can have Jimmy be the main guy to attract some sort of free agent or whatever. Now, we're going to have to see how this ends up working out for Miami, but it's just interesting to note that that's the route they chose to go with embracing Jimmy Butler, whereas Chicago was like, well, do we really want to pay this guy? Do we really want to commit to him? And I think when you go down the timeline of all that, I think you're going to find differing opinions on what was the right and wrong thing to do. But even with all that being said, I don't know. If you want a solid answer who won the Jimmy Butler trade between the Bulls and the Timber Bulls, no clue, dude. I guess it's still kind of a wait and see, even years out. Is there a timeline? Is there a cutoff point where at some point we're just like, alright, who the hell even cares? You've both just been treading water for years now. Like, maybe if the Bulls and the Wolves are in the same spot 2 seasons at this point, it's just like, alright, who really cares? Nobody won the trade. There we go. Because I think Levine's contract becomes a thing in all this as well. I mean, for all we know, the Jimmy Butler trade ends up having effects for the next 20 years of both of these teams. Who knows? Anyway, that's all I got.